All right. So thank you again and welcome everybody. My name is Rachel Bruce. I work for an organization called Wildlands Trust. We are your local land trust for Southeastern Massachusetts. And we have an interest in the city of Brockton's DW Field Park and revitalizing the park to really serve both the environment and the community. So we've started this initiative called the DW Field Park Initiative to address four key pillars of what we think need improvements in the park. And what we plan to do is bring, ideas and a master plan together, and then also bring funding in future years to get these projects implemented. So those four pillars are ecological functioning, infrastructure, recreation, and education. And so we have been working with the Conway School. You met B a few minutes ago, and Audrey, who is another student working on this project who couldn't be here today. And they've been doing an amazing job just since April in putting some conceptual designs together for some key area of the parks that a few folks in the community really identified as needing some upgrades. So we are excited to share those with you today. And I will put a link in the chat for the page on the Wildlands Trust website that has more information about the initiative as a whole and has a link where you can sign up for an email list specifically for this initiative if you haven't already. Um, we've been doing a lot of work and we're excited to really get your feedback and continue to make this project collaborative and continue to get input from the community so that everything that we're putting forward in the master plan reflects the wants and needs of the community. So I'll put that link in the chat and I'll turn it back over to B.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Yes, so I am one of a two-person team. And unfortunately, Audrey was not able to join us today because of a last-minute emergency, but I'm really grateful for you all being here and excited to share what we've been working on and hear some of your thoughts about these design ideas. I'm gonna again share the screen and just take you through a little bit of an introduction to the project so you kind of have a sense of where we're coming from and what we're thinking about with these designs. And then we will go through some specific designs for specific sites and ask for your feedback on elements of the designs that you like or think are smart or good, and elements of the designs that you don't think make as much sense for these sites. So here we go. So as you just heard, this initiative has been launched by Wildlands Trust and the city of Brockton and a number of other partners out of a recognition that it is well loved and heavily used, and could benefit from some attention to infrastructure and environment in the park that support water quality, habitat, and community activity into the future. And so we have been brought on as the Conway team to generate some designs for specific sites within the park. Oops. So this initiative is happening in multiple phases, and this first phase really focuses on the middle section of the park, which spans from Oak Street in the south to South Street in the north, and includes Waldo Lake and Upper Porter Pond. And maybe you know, maybe you do not know, that the park was originally designed as a pleasure driving park for cars to be able to wind along these scenic roads and have beautiful waterfront views 100 years ago. And that design is still in place, and it is still beautiful in many ways. And there are also some implications that that has for the way that the park is currently used. And these implications really inform the goals of this project. So one of the ways that that car-centric design has impacts today is that the roads wind really close to the water bodies. And that means that pollution and chemicals from the road drain kind of directly into the water bodies of the park, which impacts water quality. The second is that the park was originally designed to be a two-way driving loop, which, as you probably know, has now been turned into a one-direction loop, where cars and pedestrians and bikes share the road, which has raised safety concerns, especially for families with young children who are utilizing the road, not in a car. And then because the original design was for cars and people in cars, there are more spaces in the park that are sort of car specific than intended to be gathering spaces for people outside of cars. So from those implications, the goals that we are working with are to improve the ecological functioning within the park, which means looking at water quality, how stormwater is managed in the park, and habitat in the park, because there's really special habitat as well. And so the project also looks at how to protect and enhance that habitat. And the hope is to really do that through using green infrastructure. And green infrastructure basically means using natural materials like plants and trees to manage water and help filter water and clean water before it gets to surface water like ponds and rivers and lakes. The second goal is to attend to safety and accessibility improvements on the roads and in gathering spaces. And then the third is to really enhance, protect, and improve the recreation and gathering spaces that already exist within the park. So the 4 specific sites that we'll be looking at, that we have been looking at in this part of the project, are the Oak Street parking lot, the Tower Hill parking lot, or the Pentangle parking lot, or the Zigzag. We hear that it goes by many names. Which is that irregularly shaped parking lot just north of the tower on the road to your left. The amphitheater, the dam that is at the south edge of Waldo Lake, where water flows through in south into Upper Porter Pond. And then the beach on the north edge of Waldo Lake. So today we're going to focus on Oak Street parking lot and the beach and show you designs for those spaces. And before getting to designs for those spaces, we'll talk through kind of key assets and key constraints that we have either noticed or been told about at those sites to ground where the designs are headed. So starting with Oak Street, there is a lot that Oak Street has going for it as the main entrance to the middle section of the park. It is a major meetup spot for people, especially because it is open to parking even when the rest of the park is closed to cars. And there's plenty of open lawn space for people to gather on and enjoy the waterfront views. There are also some constraints on in this space. A major one being that when the gates are closed, maybe you've experienced this, people can park on both sides of that entrance drive, which can cause congestion and raises the concern that if an emergency vehicle needed to get in when the gate was closed and parking had happened on both sides, that they might not be able to. The fact that there's no accessible path into the park aside from the road, or clear directions for pedestrians upon entering makes kind of a confusing entry experience for pedestrians and people in chairs or other forms of mobility. And then in terms of ecology at the site, the lawn is compacted and stretches all the way to the shoreline, which provides minimal ecological protection for the shoreline and for the water quality there. So that leads us into this first design, and I'll say before introducing these designs, but they're really kind of thought experiments. So these designs are a way to think about if we really prioritized 1 or 2 things at the site, what might that look like? With the recognition that a final design will probably pull elements from each of the individual designs. So as you're looking at these, be thinking about like, what are individual elements or pieces of these designs that make sense or sound attractive, and individual elements that don't make sense or don't sound good, rather than necessarily it as a whole package. Does that make sense as a framing for how to look at these? Okay, cool. Thanks for your nods. So this design called Ecologically Excellent, prioritizes ecology at the site. So if you were to look at the site from driving in, as you drive in along that entrance drive, you would notice an understory of shade-tolerant shrubs and smaller plants underneath that existing tall pine grove, which would add enhanced habitat at this site, maybe invite some more birds and creatures into that entry area. As you drive in to the parking lot, you would have the opportunity to either park on a pervious parking spot, which means it's not fully asphalt. Water would be able to get into the ground through the paving surface. And there are multiple options for what that looks like, but the key thing to know is that water can get through. Or you could park underneath a solar panel array, which would both provide shade to your car and potentially provide some energy to the bathhouse that is going to be reconstructed at the site. If you arrived on foot to the park in this design, you would be welcomed onto an accessible trail. Oops, so sorry. You'd be welcomed onto an accessible trail that would lead you through that understory and either to the parking lot or along a vegetated swale, which is kind of a depression in the ground where water flows into and plants help soak the water into the ground. And along that path, you would then make your way to the shoreline. And while you wouldn't be able to actually access the shoreline here, there'd be wetland plants all the way along it. You could have a picnic in a shady area along a trail overlooking the water. Those are the key elements of this design. And I'm going to show you the second design option, and I guess share some major pros and cons of this design. So this design, again, really maximizes green infrastructure and ecology here. It brings ecological processes to the shoreline, like water filtration and soil health, and it also supports wildlife. However, it really doesn't prioritize large gathering spaces, and the parking quantity stays the same. This second design, called Great for Gathering, really prioritizes larger gathering spaces like the other design doesn't, and accessibility and safety on the roads and in gathering spaces. So in this design, if you arrive in your car or on foot or on your bike, there's a separate lane for you along the road. And when you enter the parking lot, you will notice that it has been expanded by about a third, so there are more parking spaces for you. Accessible paths line the parking lot and also lead in from that entry corner. Are you able to see my cursor as it moves along the screen? Okay. So accessible paths lead to all of the sort of main destinations at the site. One of which is this large flat gathering space where there is a picnic shelter with accessible picnic tables next to a natural play area. And this design also introduces some access to the shoreline with pebble beaches. So you could get down to the water, though not necessarily touch or interact with it or go into it, but you can get closer to it. And then again, there are stretches of the shore that are vegetated with lots of wetland plants. This design also keeps some amount of the current lawn that is there, but introduces some more formalized and accessible picnic areas along the lawn if you wanted to have a smaller gathering. And then a speed table, which is kind of like that longer, it's not necessarily just a speed bump, it's wider, means a plow can get over it in the winter, but it's a kind of traffic slowing measure. So it kind of, at the end of this stretch, slows people down and lets people know that what is happening there is changing. And people could cross over if they had come in on this side of the road and now walk along the water's edge of that entry drive. Some pros of this design are that it increases parking capacity, which we have heard is maybe a priority at this site. It takes a complete streets approach to the safer roads, meaning each type of road user has their own lane. And there's a whole range of different accessible gathering spaces for different size groups to gather. However, some cons are that it increases impervious surface on the site or pavement on the site. And access to the water might not be as good for the ecology of the shoreline, and might not be how people can most safely interact with the water at this site. So I'm curious to hear. Let's start with this design and then we'll circle back to the ecological one. What are elements of this design that stand out as positive or beneficial to folks? We'll start there and then we'll talk about ones that raise concerns or feel less beneficial for Oak Street. You can either put thoughts in the chat or just come off mute and share your thoughts.
I'll go first.
Thanks, Jane.
I think the expanded parking capacity is very positive for the project. I do know that a lot of people are seeking access to this parking lot in this area, especially before the gates open. In contrast to the other plan, you have more knowledge about it than I, but a subject of the permeability of the space where vehicles are parking is something that comes up in other forums. Have you contemplated that? I know it's like a double-edged knife, that, you know, we don't want runoff into the waterways, but at the same time, we want to mitigate other effects. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I got briefly distracted by what was popping up in the chat. Will you repeat your question? I'm so sorry.
Yep, so in regards to on the previous design, the permeability of the parking spaces versus having them be paved, I understand those connotations in regards to the stormwater runoff. What are your thoughts on the benefits versus the adverse effects of that?
Yeah, I think at this site in particular, they could be a really useful compromise, like adding parking spots, but making them permeably paved could be a really a cool way to kind of like tend both to improving parking and to stormwater management at this site. I think that's the main thing that comes up. I think in terms of yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Does that kind of answer?
Well, what I'm driving at, have you contemplated the effect of having a permeable parking space and having vehicles park on them and the potential for hazardous fluids to be leaking onto the unpaved surface?
Oh, I see. I guess I will say I'm for sure not an expert in it. I think what I have heard is that permeable materials can do a lot to filter out those chemicals, actually. So while in some ways it feels a little bit counterintuitive of like, oh, those chemicals can get into the ground, soil and the materials that get used to do that filtration can actually do a lot to kind of manage some of those chemicals.
Okay, good. As long as you're aware of it.
Totally. Yeah, thank you for that question. Appreciate that.
So, hi, this is Ken Cohen. By the way, I reside in a condominium complex that borders the park, actually borders DW Field Golf Course. So for years I've used and recreated in and really enjoyed the park. It's a wonderful gem. It's very, very important to the city. Regarding the parking area, although a permeable surface from an ecological standpoint would be wonderful from a maintenance standpoint, it would probably be very difficult to maintain. That is, from an erosion standpoint, a snow plowing standpoint, etc., to keep that space open and accessible to the people who come in. I think you need the hard surface. The expansion of the lot is very important. And in this alternative two, with the expansion of the lot, would the parking on the entrance area be eliminated and enforced, ideally by the police department or whoever would? They used to actually ticket cars along that area, and they no longer do, and it is a very, very congested part of the entrance, especially up until about noontime every day. I was just wondering if the parking restrictions would be enforced on that entryway.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much. It's cool to know that you live right by the park and are a longtime user and lover of it. Thanks for being here. And yeah, this design the lane narrows the road so that it's a narrower two-way entryway, and then the pedestrian lane and bike lane would be either elevated or separated by bollards, kind of those tall, often like white plastic sort of posts, which would mean that parking along that entryway really wouldn't be possible anymore. So that is kind of how this design approaches that issue. Yeah.
And that lot would now have, what, about 50 spaces instead of the 30 something?
Approximately. Yeah, this is definitely still more at the conceptual space, but that is around the numbers that we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. Rob, I see your hand.
Hi. While I'm not a huge fan of expanding the parking, I realize that is a concern for a lot of people. But there's no reason why it can't be made more permeable. We have permeable parking in a lot of areas in the Northeast and Northern Midwest, and if they can figure out how to plow it, I'm sure we can too. Question about, on this particular design, a question about the pebble beaches and how rapidly does the water drop off there and get deep, and is that encouraging people to over interact with the water? I know people like to fish in this area, and this would certainly allow for fishing, but does it also encourage more problem?
Right, that's definitely the question. You're definitely picking up on kind of what we're getting at there. I think my understanding is that the water there is fairly shallow, but I think it raises the question of, is that something that is desired by you or other folks in this space in terms of interacting with water, or does it feel better to not have that be quite as accessible?
I mean, people do like to fish, and having areas that are fishable and have better visual access might be more preferable to areas that are farther into the park, where if you slip in, nobody's going to see you. And so, it's, I don't know, 6 of 1.
Yeah, totally.
But I do like the idea of the swales and moving water into the vegetated swales off of the parking lots, off of the roadways, to protect the water quality of the lake. I do like the separated bike lanes. An elevated bike lane, elevated pedestrian lane would be best, rather than the ugly plastic bollards. But I think this has some really good points to it.
Cool. Thank you. I'm going to bring us back to the first design and ask sort of similarly, it sounds like folks were addressing the permeable parking. Are there any other elements of this design that stand out to people as positive or appealing?
A few things in the chat that I can pull out here.
Thanks, Rachel.
Alex and Shelley were wondering if this vegetation, I think in both designs along the shoreline, would block views of the water and wildlife. And later commented that people want to get to the water to watch and interact with the wildlife.
Appreciate that. The idea with the vegetation is that there would be areas where it would be taller and not have view lines through it, but for sure where those picnic areas are, would have spaces where views were accessible to the water. Yeah, definitely acknowledging that that is important and a beloved aspect of this site.
There's also a few things in the chat about permeable surfaces, and I think I would just like to clarify and kind of throw out there that there are a number of different types of permeable surfaces that we can explore. We are working with engineers on this master plan as well, and so we can bring recommendations forward based on a number of aspects and a number of options. But it's not all just like a loose gravel. It can look and feel, and a lot of times like very much like the pavement that you're familiar with. So it can be, snow removal is possible, and accessibility is possible as well. So it's not just like a loose gravel in every scenario.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. That's a great clarification point. Rob?
I do want to say I like the added picnic shelters or picnic areas and close to the water. That's really cool. I like the idea of adding natural vegetation to an artificial lake. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think yeah, appreciate, for folks who don't know, the water bodies in the park are man-made. They are not naturally occurring. And so the idea of how do you tend to ecology of a human-made site is a question. The ecologist at our school likes to say, if there are ecological processes happening there now, that counts for a lot. And while it's important to know about the history and its implications, it is valuable to look at that as a natural space, but definitely it is an interesting aspect of ecology at this site.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Under the words all persons trail, there's a lot of squiggly lines. And what does that imply?
Thanks. That implies like a low ground cover that's not lawn, but could be walked on, or could be just low vegetation that's not encouraging people to walk on that space. So is kind of up for interpretation and thoughts. Thanks, John, in the chat for sharing. Love having the PV array in this design. Good to know. I'm going to move us forward to the second site, which is the beach to the north of Waldo Lake, unless there are any final thoughts, appreciations, or concerns about either of these two designs for Oak Street.
I was just gonna,
go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. I was gonna say, I just echo the sentiment for design number 2 about giving more instruction on how to use the road and allowing cars, bikes, and pedestrians to right from the beginning know how to, share the road. I appreciate that. And going back to design 1, I really also echoing the thought, I really like more picnic space and just allowing that to be for more people to gather there. Those are just my thoughts.
Cool. Thank you so much, Shoshana.
Before we jumped, I did want to say I'd like the idea of low mow or no mow areas to include, more native species and herbaceous plants in this area. But people tend to want to kick soccer balls around, and I think a taller grass would discourage that and keep people from trampling down and compacting the soil.
So in having some spaces where sports are still possible here is positive.
Rob,
Oh,
you're on mute.
still on mute.
Oh, I hit the wrong button. Didn't want to go too far out on a limb, but this wasn't this is supposed to be much more natural. That was the place for it. So more, and you mentioned the word lawn in some of these, and I see more meadow than I do lawn.
Cool. Appreciate that clarification. Thanks.
In my humble opinion.
Okay.
Mhm.
Oh,
I
Rachel,
think there's
was there
only
something you
one thing
wanted
we
to add?
haven't. Yeah, just in the chat early on, Ken had asked about paying for the renovations of the park and when they would be scheduled to begin. So I just want to clarify that for everybody as we move forward. I don't want you to think about the cost restrictions. Right now, we're really in like, what do we want to see here? And then as far as paying for those renovations that do get put forward in a master plan, we would be working with the city of Brockton to apply for grants from both the state of Massachusetts and from like federal larger grants. And we would be bringing in private money and doing these projects over the next 10 or more years. So we're not looking to like add a tax or, put a burden on the city to pay for these designs. We're looking to really bring funding in from external sources. So don't let that restrict your ideas for like what you want to see happen here.
Quick comment on that. I was wondering if grants are currently in process and have grants been approved for this specifically as yet?
Sure. So Wildlands Trust received a private grant to do this planning phase of the project, and that's what we're working with right now. And part of that planning is going to be identifying grants for the implementation of these projects. So there are no implementation grants in the application stage yet, but they will be as soon as next year.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel, for that. And thanks, John and Alex and Shelly in the chat. I see there are other places in the park farther away from the water that may be better for kicking a ball around. And the idea that walkable meadows with native flowers that attract pollinators would be a good idea in this space. And see your thumbs too, Rob. Shifting gears to the beach up at the north of Waldo Lake. Again, we'll talk through what we understand to be the assets and constraints of the site and then walk through two pretty different design alternatives. So this space is well loved, we understand, is like a major gathering space and space of beloved memories for lots of folks in the park. You can pull in from the north and have shady views of the water in your car, or get out and head to the beach for swan watching, duck feeding, sitting by the water. It is really seems to be an intergenerational space that lots of folks enjoy the waterfront views and the waterfowl. And oops, hello, there we go. And then some constraints that are at this site are that the asphalt and that is crumbling along the edge of the road and the paved sort of slides that head into the water really raise pollution concerns and sort of compromise the ecological functioning of the site. And then the steep nature of the beach here between the road and the water makes the site inaccessible for folks. And just the fact that it's pretty hot and exposed, there's not a ton of shade along that long strip of beach, can make it an uncomfortable experience in hotter weather. So, hello, there we go. This first design, Wander Along a Wetland, again, really prioritizes ecological functioning at this site. So coming along the one-way loop from the north, if you were on foot, you might be welcomed onto this boardwalk, which winds along the shoreline, which has now been vegetated with lots and lots of wetland plants and trees. The boardwalk, you could walk along and maybe learn some things about wetlands and wildlife at the site, or pause at a bench to stop and look or just rest. If you were in a car, you would be directed to kind of the back where now there is parking. The road would be realigned to back there, pulling the road away from the water as far as possible without causing disturbance to the west, which is now currently woods. And then there would be these pull-in parallel parking spots if you did want to stop here and get out of your car or just hang out in your car and probably see a little bit through the wetland vegetation area, but it would be more prioritizing a walking experience along the boardwalk. Getting down to this southern end of the area, a sort of sun deck preserves that sunny experience of the beach, and is separated from the road with boulders and bollards so that cars wouldn't be pulling in here. And then the shared road continues to the south. So some pros of this design are that, again, it really maximizes green infrastructure with large plantings to sink and filter runoff, capture carbon, and provide shade, and reduces impervious surfaces and replaces them with wetland shrubs and swamp habitat. Some cons are that it's a pretty big cultural shift from what happens there now. It has limited gathering spaces and reduces parking capacity at the site. This second design prioritizes gathering spaces and accessibility. So again, coming from the north, the road, you would encounter another speed table to sort of slow traffic, and cars can come to the right on the road. Again, that road is realigned, but this time you can pull in and really, there's the same number of parking spaces as exist now. And you can pull in and get that waterfront view because now your car is facing the lake. For folks on foot or getting out of their car, this is now a large, wide, flat, accessible gathering area with some shade trees separated from parking by some low vegetation. A natural play area at the southern end of this gathering space provides an activity for kids. And then the main feature of this design is really some sort of oversized steps for sitting and gathering and being near the water, but not actively interacting with it at this site. And then farther down this way, the current bump out area would again be more heavily vegetated between the gathering space and the water, but would provide sort of a more quiet gathering space or sort of solo area. And then to the south of the beach, this sort of promenade feature with bump outs with benches and a walking path behind it before sort of petering out into the existing path that heads then down south to the amphitheater. This design also features sort of large picnic landing with multiple picnic spots at the very north end of the beach and a place to park your bike if that is how you are moving through the park. Some pros of this second design are that it really maximizes gathering spaces and accessibility and offers alternative activities at the site. Cons are that there are fewer opportunities for stormwater management through green infrastructure, and there is less habitat creation. Humans are really prioritized in this design. So I already see folks adding feedback to the chat, which thank you. So we can start with that, and then I will open it up to a similar discussion as the first site. So let's see. Where do these start? If additional property were acquired, I would be in favor of moving the road west to improve the beach area. Okay, so liking the idea of moving the road away from the water. Another comment about Oak Street, but then not enough parking in Beach Concept 1 as a concern. Okay, not a fan of removing the water views from the cars. Hopefully some boulders or other vehicle stops to prevent parked vehicles from entering through vegetation into gathering areas. Absolutely, separating car spaces from human gathering spaces is a big priority. See a preference for number 2. And then the question, would you be able to interact with the ducks and swans in the second one? Yes, I think less easily than currently is available in terms of duck and swan interaction. And then is the road high enough to see the waterfowl, etc.? Yeah, in that second design, the water views are definitely pretty much the same as they are now, but there's sort of more gathering space for humans between cars and the water, but cars can definitely still see the water. Alternative 2 would definitely be less of a cultural shift for sure. And those stairs are nice. Yeah, that precedent picture is nice. It's pretty beautiful. Any other yeah, folks can keep posting things in the chat. If anyone would like to come off mute and share individual elements of, we'll start with this second design again, the gathering spaces one. Individual elements that you appreciate or what would like to see at the beach.
B, could you go back to the slide?
Yes, the previous one where you can see it in from above. Sorry, 1 second. It sounds like there's appreciation for the steps and that people like the idea of maintaining cars being able to see the lake and having the same amount of parking. Are there other elements of this or pieces of this that you all like or think should get incorporated into a final design?
So the cars can see the waterfront. Will bikers also be able to see that easily?
I guess if you are just biking through this area, yes, not directly, but the bike lane gets directed to the sort of outer lane, so they'd be to the right of cars. For specifically the gathering beach area, they'd be pretty far away from the beach, but then down to the south along the promenade area, they would again have pretty much the same view as they have now.
Okay, I just asked because I bike and that's the view. So that's like as a biker, that's the water view you get. So just in future planning, keeping that in mind to keep it as that everybody can view it and enjoy it. You know what I mean? Instead of going past, so on the design, if I'm riding my bike, I'm going past it and looking to the side for not as long as it is, right? So I'm not being able to enjoy the full water view, if that makes sense for this scene. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think there's no other, like if I'm on bike and I'm hitting straight, I don't really get any other wide open view of the water.
That's a good
Mm.
point. Something that is tricky to figure out is how to manage. You've got people wanting to walk and sort of move slowly along the waterfront, and people getting out of cars or to move to that gathering space, and figuring out how bikers can most safely move through that activity, while not then posing a safety concern to like a small kid who's in that space, is definitely is tricky. So I'm curious, so if you were biking through this space, what would be your preference for where the bike lane would go?
I would think like closer in, so towards the left. As it is now, I think the left lane is for pedestrians and bikers, and then the right outer lane is for cars. So, as close as the water, but I do see the point of like keeping that separate from people enjoying, sitting down on the steps. Honestly, I don't have an answer. I just wanted to make it a point to just to be mindful of, that's the big view as a biker when you're going past the lake. So honestly, I don't have any. I would have to sit on it and think about it.
Totally. Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot. I appreciate
No,
you giving
no
the
problem.
bike experience for sure.
So I have a couple of thoughts on this arrangement, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think most people who bike through the park are going through the park and not making a lot of stops. Also, on our roads, our bike lanes are always to the right of the cars, and this would kind of be a continuation of that. And lastly, where the parking spaces are makes so much sense as opposed to where they are now. Right now, if you want to access the water edge from the parking spaces, you have to cross the road, which is can be a very dangerous thing in some cases. Right now, where the parking spaces are, they're on the opposite side, closer to the water's edge, and less of a hazard for pedestrians. Therefore, not having to cross the road. I like this design.
Thanks, Ken. Rob?
Can you just quickly, I'm having a thought as we're going on. Can you go the one slide forward where you get the axiometric view? If that's what that's called?
Yeah. This one?
Yeah. I realize that the bikes need to be on the right-hand side because that's, tradition, blah, blah, blah. And you don't want people on the diagonal parking to back out over the bike lane to then proceed forward. But given the topography, and I don't know how much of a drop there is at this point, can the bike lane be a slightly higher on the upside to get a better view over the tops of the cars?
Oh, I see. That's an interesting idea. That's a good point. Maybe. Yeah.
Because if you move the bike and pedestrian path up a little bit, if you don't choose to walk down to the promenade, then you have this higher look over the top.
Yeah, that idea of people moving through the space, whether that is bike or car, is higher so as to facilitate views. That's a great idea.
That's an idea.
Yeah. See some other comments in the chat. Agreed on the bike view too. Only place we really ride for that reason. That's good to know. How would you get down from the road to the beach? If the road is a higher up, bikes could go up there too. Yeah. So getting down to the road from the beach.
Well, if you
Not
now
from the
flip
road
back to the
connection.
other, you have 2 points of access. You know, at the beginning and the end of the trail that you can go either way to get to the, if you go back a slide, where you have your speed tables, you're making a decision. Do I go up or do I get off my bike and walk through the promenade?
Yeah,
And you reconnect back at the next bike, a speed table at the bottom.
right. Yeah. So you could either kind of just flow along the road into the gathering space if you're on foot, or if you wanted to hop off your bike and hang out in this space, or if you're in a car, you have the opportunity to pull into a parking space, and then there's this sort of, it's pretty tiny here because of the scale, but you can get out of your car and then just head directly to this space. Yeah, from your car, just as you would
Yeah.
in any sort of parking lot experience. And then what about all the combined groups? Kids on bikes, parents walking around them on the walking path. Where do they go at that point? Yeah, so I think the idea is that it
It's
turns
split.
into, it's more of a slow moving gathering space. But if you want to continue kind of just walking along, you kind of move through the gathering space. But that seems like it's a pretty spacious area, so that could happen. But it's definitely not like just as direct, maybe as the road continuing on for walkers and bikers at that point.
And I think there's a better separation of pedestrian and bikes and vehicles with this design. Because as you're coming down, you know, you're separated as you hit the speed bump, and then you either walk to the left and down the promenade, or you go up to the right and you stay high. And you're not interacting with the cars that are trying to back in and out.
Thanks, Rob. Barbara?
Hi, I just wanted to say I liked a lot of things in this alternative to design. As a grandparent, and I live adjacent to the park. I love the idea of the natural play area for children. And the large step area sounds really good too. This isn't a lot of aspects of this. I love the parking on that side of the road as opposed to the other side of the road. Many different things with this plan I really do like. Good idea with the speed bumps before and after, so that traffic does slow down in that area too. So thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. And then it looks like there's conversation in the chat about duck feeding and kind of the ecological impacts of that. Yeah, it's a tricky thing because it's such a sweet activity that so many people have such good memories of, and it's such a beautiful intergenerational activity that people do. And then, yeah, ducks and geese have an impact on water quality. So just kind of trying to find how to manage that in the park going forward is definitely a conversation. We are coming right up on an hour of your time, and so I want to start to wrap up.
We haven't talked about one.
We haven't talked about one. I felt like people were kind of getting at it, but that is true. So if you are able to hang out for another few moments, if there are elements of this design that stand out as positive or particularly concerning, would also love to hear.
Natural shoreline.
Is positive, Rob, for you?
I think it is.
I have a question. After this Zoom is concluded, could these slides be made available to participants?
Yeah, absolutely. This recording will get posted as well. I'm not totally sure where, Rachel, but maybe you know.
Yeah, we can share it, far and wide. And we will also be able to email everybody who signed up. So you all, and there's a few other folks who signed up too. So we'll email you all the recording.
Thanks.
Okay.
There was a few things in the chat from earlier just about folks not really loving the reduced parking in this design. And I think also just the having it be parallel so that the cars aren't looking at the water was mentioned earlier.
So preserving the parking capacity and the experience for people in cars is feeling important to folks. Thanks. Any other things that are standing out about this design?
Alex and Shelley in the chat also love the boardwalk, and maybe other areas that there could be boardwalk included too. Would allow the landscape to be less modified.
Thanks, Alex and Shelley.
Are there places where the boardwalk could go over the water?
Yeah, there are. I think this design kind of has it bumping out over the water in places and then moving back and bumping out. So it's a bit of a meandering experience. Yeah. So the idea of a boardwalk is feeling appealing, either here or other places in the park. That's good to know. Okay, I'm gonna wrap us up. I'm gonna stop sharing just so that the screen goes away and I'll see each other's faces. So appreciate you coming today and sharing your thoughts and feedback about these designs and this process. This recording will be posted, as Rachel mentioned, so you'll have access to looking at the designs and sort of revisiting this conversation. And we are so open and happy to hear feedback from folks. So if you have a follow-up thought or this prompts a conversation with someone else who is a park user, we would love to hear from you. So thanks again for joining us, giving us an hour of time on your precious Sunday, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you guys for doing this.
Thanks for coming out, Rob. Okay, let's see. I'm going to end the recording and